The summit of Mount Everest is often celebrated as the ultimate triumph of human endurance. The roof of the world where the sky touches the earth, but those who have studied the mountain's history know a darker truth. The summit is only halfway. The true test and often the ultimate tragedy lies in the descent. In the thin, freezing air of the death zone, above 26,000 feet, the body begins to die. And the line between a legendary victory and a frozen grave is terrifiedly thin. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to October 1979, to tell the story of a man who was larger than life. His name was Ray Genet, but the climbing world knew him simply as the Pirate. He was an American icon, a man who had carved his name into the ice of Denali in Alaska, acting as a guide for decades. He was strong, boisterous, and seemingly invincible, a force of nature, who felt more at home on a glacier than in a living room. But Everest is a different beast entirely. It does not care for reputations, and it shows no mercy to those who linger too long in its shadow. Ray Genet's story is not just about the physical climb. It is a haunting reminder of how exhaustion and a single decision to rest can change everything. Welcome to Ben Stories. We are dedicated to uncovering the raw, unfiltered tales of mountaineering, history, stories of courage, tragedy, and the unyielding power of nature. If you value detailed, respectful storytelling about the men and women who push the limits of human possibility, please take a moment to subscribe and join our community. Now, let us step onto the ice and journey back to 1979. To truly understand the tragedy of 1979, you have to understand the man at the center of it. Ray Genet wasn't just a climber. He was an Alaskan folk hero. Back in Talkeetna, he was known as the Pirate, a nickname that fit his swashbuckling, bearded demeanor perfectly. He wasn't a technical wizard on the rock face like the nimble Europeans of the era, nor was he a high-altitude scientist. Ray was built like a bear, relying on brute strength, unimaginable stamina, and a stubbornness that was legendary. He had guided hundreds of people up Denali, North America's highest peak. He knew the cold, he knew suffering. He was a man who seemed carved out of the very granite he climbed. But Everest was the crown jewel he hadn't yet claimed. At 48 years old, Ray wasn't a young man anymore. His beard was flecked with gray, but his spirit was as wild as ever. He felt invincible. He joined a German expedition led by Dr. Hannelore Schmatz, a serious, disciplined affair that stood in stark contrast to Ray's looser, rougher Alaskan style. The expedition also included Hannelore Schmatz, Gerhard's wife. She was a formidable climber in her own right, attempting to become the first German woman to summit Everest. The dynamic within the team was intense and driven by high stakes. Just days prior to Ray's climb, Gerhard Schmatz himself had summited. At 50 years old, he became the oldest man to reach the top at that time. He had made it down safely, exhausted but triumphant. This success created a silent, heavy pressure on the second team. The husband had done it. Now the wife had to follow. It was Ray Genet, Hannelore Schmatz, and the incredibly strong Sherpa Sentinel, who prepared to make their bid for history. It is important to remember that October on Everest is not like May. Most commercial climbing happens in the spring, where there is a window of relative calm, but the autumn post-monsoon season, that is a different world entirely. The temperatures are significantly lower, the snow is deeper, and the jet stream winds begin to lower themselves onto the summit like a crushing weight. When Ray and Hannelore prepared for their final push from the South Cal camp, for at 26,000 feet they were stepping out of their tents and into a deep freeze. They left the safety of the camp in the dead of night, the beams of their headlamps cutting through the swirling smoke. The ascent was brutal from the very first step, even for a man as strong as Ray Genet. The lack of oxygen at this altitude was a sledgehammer. Every movement required a distinct act of will. Breathe, step, breathe, rest. Hannelore was determined to match her husband's feat, moving with a quiet, steely resolve. But the mountain was fighting them every inch of the way. The progress was slow, agonizingly slow. In high-altitude mountaineering, time is the only currency that matters. You have a strict budget. If you overspend your energy and time on the way up, you have nothing left to pay for the way down. As the sun began to arc across the sky, seasoned climbers would have turned back. The turnaround time, usually 1 p.m. or 2 p.m., came and went, but the summit was right there. It was taunting them, so close they could almost touch the sky. The allure of the top is a siren song that has seduced the most rational minds. And Ray, the pirate who had never backed down from a fight in his life, was not going to turn around now. They reached the summit late in the afternoon. It was October 2nd. The view was spectacular, the curvature of the earth visible on the horizon, the world falling away beneath their boots. For a brief, shimmering moment, they were the highest people on the planet. Ray Genet had done it. The king of Denali was now standing on the roof of the world. Hannelore had done it, securing her place in history. But as they took their photos and unfurled their flags, the shadows were already lengthening. The sun, their only source of warmth, was dipping dangerously low. The euphoria of the summit is a dangerous drug because it masks the body's depletion. They had used up their reserves. Their oxygen tanks were running critically low. And now, as the adrenaline began to fade, the terrifying reality of their situation crashed down upon them. They were at 29,029 feet. It was late afternoon. The temperature was plummeting toward 40 degrees below zero, and they had to walk all the way back down to the South Col. The descent began, but the spring was gone from their steps. Gravity, usually an ally on the way down, became a heavy burden on their tired legs. Ray, the man of infinite strength, began to falter. The massive engine that had powered him up Denali so many times was running on fumes. Hannelore, too, was stumbling. They were moving painfully slow, traversing the knife-edge ridges where a single slip meant oblivion. As twilight bled into the inky blackness of night, the wind picked up, howling across the exposed ridges. They were moving too slowly to reach the safety of the tents. They were caught in the death zone in the dark, and the realization began to set in. They were not going to make it down. They would have to do the unthinkable. They would have to stop. The descent from the summit of Everest in the dark is less like mountain climbing and more like walking a tightrope over a black abyss while suffocating. By 8 p.m., the world had reduced itself to the narrow, shaking beam of their headlamps. The cold at this hour, in October, is not something you feel on your skin, it is something you feel in your marrow. It is a physical weight, pressing down on the chest, slowing the heart, thickening the blood. Ray Genet, the unstoppable force of nature, was beginning to stop. They had reached an altitude of roughly 27,900 feet, 8,500 meters. They were still high in the death zone, far above the safety of the South Col. The oxygen in their cylinders was gone. Now, every breath they took contained only a fraction of the oxygen needed to sustain human life. The brain, starved of fuel, begins to shut down non-essential functions. Coordination goes first, then rationality. Sungdair Sherpa, the incredibly strong guide accompanying them, knew exactly what was happening. He knew the golden rule of high-altitude survival: you must keep moving. If you stop, you freeze. If you sit down, you never get up. Sungdair urged Ray to keep walking. He pleaded with him. He tried to pull the big American forward, but Ray Genet was finished. The engine that had carried him up Denali countless times had simply seized up. "I'm hanging it up," Ray reportedly said. It wasn't a panicked scream. It was a resignation. It was the exhaustion speaking, the overwhelming desire to just close his eyes and rest for a moment. Ray collapsed into the snow. He didn't fall. He simply sat down and refused to move. He began to dig a shallow hole in the snow, a bivouac in the loosest sense of the word. In mountaineering terms, a bivouac at 27,900 feet without a tent, without sleeping bags, and without oxygen is a death sentence. It is an open invitation to hypothermia. Hannelore Schmatz, who was also faltering but perhaps more lucid, sat down nearby. Sungdair Sherpa faced a terrible choice. He could have descended alone. He had the strength to save himself. But the code of the Sherpa, and his loyalty to the climbers, held him there. He stayed. The three of them huddled together in the snow, tiny specks of life against the infinite blackness of the Himalayas. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped to levels that are difficult to comprehend, likely nearing 50 degrees below zero with the wind chill. At these temperatures, the body enters a state of desperate preservation. Blood is shunted away from the extremities, the fingers, toes, ears, and nose, to keep the heart, lungs, and brain warm. Frostbite sets in within minutes. But the most terrifying aspect of that night wasn't just the cold, it was the mind. Ray Genet, the pirate, began to drift away. Climbers who have survived similar ordeals describe a sensation of warmth, a comfortable drowsiness that masks the dying process. As the hypothermia deepened, Ray became delirious. He wasn't on the side of Everest anymore. In his mind, perhaps he was back in Alaska, or sitting by a warm fire in a lodge. He began to speak, but the words made no sense. He talked about things that weren't there. He adjusted invisible equipment. This is the final stage, where the boundary between reality and the dream world dissolves. It is heartbreaking to imagine a man so full of life, so commanding and powerful, reduced to a murmuring shadow in the snow. He curled up, his body finally surrendering to the elements he had spent his life conquering. Hannelore and Sungdair watched in horror, helpless to intervene. They were fighting their own battles to keep their blood flowing, hitting their limbs, trying to stay conscious. The wind howled over the ridge, burying them in Snoodhoft. It was the longest night imaginable, hours, stretching into eternities. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, before the first light of dawn could touch the peaks, the pirates' struggle ended. Ray Genet did not wake up. The man who had survived the wildest storms of North America quietly passed away, his heart stopping in the thin air of the death zone. He remained there, curled in the snow, frozen in time. When the sun finally rose on October 3rd, it illuminated a tragic scene. Ray was gone. Hannelore Schmatz and Sungdair Sherpa were still alive, but they were shattered. They had survived the night, a miracle in itself, but the cost had been astronomical. They were severely frostbitten, dehydrated, and emotionally broken. And now, Hannelore had to do the hardest thing a climber ever has to do. She had to leave her teammate behind. She had to stand up, turn her back on Ray Genet's body, and try to walk down. She had survived the night, but the mountain wasn't done with her yet. The descent was far from over, and the tragedy of the 1979 expedition was about to claim its second victim. Hannelore stood up. Her movements were jerky and uncoordinated. Sungdair, suffering from severe frostbite on his feet, urged her on. Down. We must go down. But as they began the descent, something was wrong. Hannelore wasn't moving right. The night had taken more from her than she realized. She took a few steps, then a few more, and then, just 330 feet below their bivouac site, she stopped. She requested water. She sat down to rest, just for a second. And in that moment, the terrifying echo of the previous night returned. The mountain, having claimed the pirate, was now reaching out for the first German woman to summit its peak. Hannelore Schmatz was a woman of immense discipline. You do not climb to the top of the world without a will of iron. She had survived a night without shelter at 27,900 feet, a feat that defies medical explanation. She had watched her friend and teammate, the legendary Ray Genet, drift away into the eternal sleep just hours before. She knew, with terrifying clarity, what the stakes were. She knew she had to move. And yet, the body has limits that willpower cannot override. They had descended only a short distance from Ray's final resting place, barely 100 meters vertical descent. To a climber at sea level, this is a warm-up at 27,000 feet. After a night exposed to the jet stream, it is a marathon. Hannelore's legs, likely heavy with the onset of cerebral or pulmonary edema, simply stopped obeying her commands. She turned to Sungdair Sherpa. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. According to the accounts, she simply said, "Water, water." She sat down in the snow. It was a casual motion, the way one might sit on a park bench after a long jog. She leaned back against her backpack to catch her breath, perhaps to fumble for a water bottle that was likely frozen solid. Sungdair, desperate and terrified, urged her to stand up. He knew that Ray had sat down and never stood up. He saw history repeating itself in reality, but Hannelore Schmatz did not struggle. She did not fight. As soon as she sat, her head tilted back. Her eyes remained open, staring fixedly at the sky she had just conquered. And just like that, she was gone. It wasn't a slow drift into delirium like Ray. It was a sudden, catastrophic system failure. Her heart, pushed beyond its absolute limit, had beaten its last. Sungdair Sherpa was now the loneliest man on the face of the earth. Imagine the horror of his position. He was standing in the death zone, flanked by the fresh corpses of two of the strongest climbers he knew. He was suffering from grade 4 frostbite. His fingers and toes were turning black, deadened by the cold of the bivouac. He had done everything humanly possible, more than possible, to save them. He had stayed when others would have run. He had cajoled, pulled, and pleaded. But the mountain had taken them both. Now, survival instinct took over. Sungdair had to leave Hannelore where she sat. There was no way to move her. A body at that altitude is dead weight, frozen and immovable. With a heavy heart and a body screaming in agony, he began the solitary limp down to Camp 4, down at the South Col. The rest of the team and the support Sherpas were waiting in agonizing suspense. They had seen the lights on the ridge the night before. They knew something had gone wrong. When Sungdair finally stumbled into camp, alone, a wreck of a man, the magnitude of the tragedy settled over the expedition like a shroud. Ray Genet, the pirate of Denali, was dead. Hannelore Schmatz, the first German woman to summit Everest, was dead. But this is where the story takes a turn that makes it unique in Everest lore. Usually, when climbers die high on the mountain, they are either buried under snow by storms, fall down faces into inaccessible crevasses, or are pushed off the path by teammates to give them a respectful committal to the void. Hannelore was different. She died sitting up. She died on the main route, the heels of the standard southeast ridge path. And because the winds on Everest are so ferocious, they swept the snow around her away. They didn't bury her. They preserved her. The extreme sub-zero temperatures froze her body in that exact position, sitting up, leaning against her pack, her eyes open, her hair blowing in the wind. For years, she wasn't just a memory. She became a landmark. Climbers pushing for the summit in the years that followed would recount the chilling experience of encountering the German woman. In the dim light of the alpine start, hallucinating from lack of oxygen, climbers would see a figure sitting by the trail. Some would wave, thinking it was a resting climber. Some would even try to speak to her, asking if she was okay, before realizing with a jolt of horror that the figure was frozen solid, her eyes staring blankly at eternity. She became a silent sentinel of the death zone, a ghost warning everyone who passed. You can conquer the summit, but you must respect the descent. Her presence there, at 27,600 feet, became a source of deep distress, not just for climbers, but for her husband, Gerhard. He had returned home a widower, having achieved his dream but lost his life partner in the process. The thought of his wife sitting there, exposed to the elements and the gaze of every passing stranger, was a torment. In the mountaineering community, a debate began. Should she be left there, as part of the mountain, or did we have a duty to bring her down, or at least move her from the path? The Sherpas believe that the mountain is a goddess, Mualang Sangma. They believe that leaving bodies to litter the goddess's sanctuary is bad karma, and practically, for the climbers, seeing a dead woman sitting up and watching them was psychologically devastating. 5 years passed, the wind continued to blow through Hannelore's hair, the seasons turned, Ray Genet's body remained buried under the snow higher up, hidden from view. But Hannelore remained visible. a tragic monument to the 1979 disaster. Then, in 1984, a decision was made. It was time to bring peace to the mountain. It was time to hide the German woman from the world and give her a proper burial. A recovery mission was launched, but Everest does not give up its dead easily. In fact, it often demands a trade. And the men who went up to move Hannelore Schmatz were about to learn that disturbing the dead in the death zone comes with a terrible price. By 1984, the legend of the German woman had spread far beyond the climbing community. Hannelore Schmatz had become a macabre waypoint, a frozen statue marking the boundary between the living and the dead. For 5 years, every climber attempting the summit from the south side had to pass her. They had to look into her open, frozen eyes. They had to step around the woman who had sat down to rest and never stood up. It was a grim reminder that on Everest, you are only ever a guest, and a fragile one at that. But for the Sherpa people, and for the families of the fallen, leaving a body exposed to the wind and the gaze of strangers is a heavy spiritual burden. In the Sherpa worldview, the mountain is sacred. To leave the dead littering the goddess mother of the world is to invite bad luck. It disrupts the sanctity of the high peaks. And for the Nepal police, who oversee the regulations of the mountain, there was a growing sense of duty. The decision was made to launch a mission to clean up the South Col route. The Nepal Police Mountaineering Expedition of 1984 was not a tourist jaunt. It was a serious, disciplined operation. Among their objectives was the grim task of recovering Hannelore Schmatz's body. They intended to free her from the ice and commit her body to the Kungshung Phaisa Sheer, 10,000-foot drop to the east. In mountaineering burials, this is considered respectful. It returns the climber to the deep silence of the glacier, far away from the prying eyes of the trade route. 2 men took the lead on this dangerous assignment: Inspector Yogendra Bahadur Thapa and a Sherpa named Eng Dorje. These were not novices. They were strong, capable men who understood the risks. But they were about to engage in one of the most dangerous activities possible in the death zone, moving a dead weight. To understand why this is so deadly, you have to understand the physics of 27,000 feet. Up there, simply lifting your own arm feels like lifting a lead weight. Your blood is thick like sludge. Your heart is racing just to keep you conscious. Now, imagine trying to move a frozen human body. A body that has been on the mountain for 5 years is not just lying on the snow. It has become part of the mountain. The ice grows around it, anchoring it to the rock. Hannelore was frozen solid, fused to the earth. To move her, Thapa and Eng Dorje had to hack away at the ice, swinging ice axes with muscles starved of oxygen. Every swing consumed precious energy. Every minute they spent working was a minute they were dying. It was October 24, 1984. The autumn winds, the same winds that had killed Ray and Hannelore 5 years earlier, were beginning to whip across the ridge. The 2 men reached Hannelore. They worked to free her. It was a gruesome, exhausting task. They were fighting physics, fighting the cold, and fighting the mountain itself. They managed to dislodge her, preparing to move her toward the edge for the committal. And then, the mountain snapped, the trap shut. We will never know exactly what happened in that split second. Perhaps a crampon snagged on a rock. Perhaps a sudden gust of wind, the invisible hand of Everest, caught them off balance. Perhaps it was simply the exhaustion of the effort causing a momentary lapse in concentration. But in the blink of an eye, disaster struck. While trying to move Hannelore Schmatz, both Inspector Yogendra Bahadur Thapa and Eng Dorje fell. They didn't just slip, they plummeted. They fell down the precipitous slopes of the Everest face, disappearing into the white void below. In a tragic, heart-wrenching twist of fate, the attempt to recover one body had resulted in the creation of 2 more. The arithmetic of Everest is cruel and uncompromising. It does not care about good intentions. It does not care about respect for the dead. It demands a toll for every mistake. And sometimes, it demands a toll even when you do everything right. The expedition team below was devastated. They had gone up to cleanse the mountain, to bring peace to a wandering spirit. And instead, the mountain had claimed 2 of their best. As for Hannelore Schmatz, in the chaos of the accident, or perhaps carried by the same movement that killed the men, her body was finally released from its vigil. She was swept over the edge, likely falling down the Kungshung face, the exact burial ground the men had intended for her. The wind and gravity finally finished the job that Thapa and Eng Dorje had died trying to start. She was gone from the trail. The German woman was no longer keeping watch over the route. She had vanished into the deep, inaccessible glaciers thousands of feet below, taking her rescuers with her into history. Ray Genet, the pirate, remained where he was, buried deep under the snow higher up the ridge. He had been spared the indignity of being a landmark, his body hidden by the winter storms, sleeping eternally in the place he loved most, the wild, high, cold places of the earth. This tragedy sent a shockwave through the climbing world. It reinforced a dark lesson that every high-altitude mountaineer must eventually learn: leave the dead where they fall. It sounds harsh, even heartless to those of us sitting in comfortable chairs at sea level. We want to bring our heroes home. We want closure. But above 26,000 feet, standard morality does not apply. The energy required to bring a body down is often the exact amount of energy required to stay alive. To spend it on the dead is to join them. Ray Genet and Hannelore Schmatz went to Everest in 1979 chasing a dream. They were strong, experienced, and full of life. They achieved their summit. They stood on top of the world. But the price of that view was everything they had. And as the years rolled on, their story became more than just a climbing accident. It became a parable, a warning about the turnaround time, a warning about the seduction of the summit, and a warning that on Everest, the descent is where the real climb begins. As we look back at their lives today, we shouldn't just see the tragedy. We should see the spirit that drove them there. Ray Genet lived a life that was louder, bigger, and bolder than most men could dream of. He didn't want to die in a bed. He wanted to be where the air was thin and the stakes were high. He got his wish in the most absolute way possible. But what can we, the living, learn from the pirate and the Sentinel? What is the takeaway from a story so steeped in loss? As we close the book on the 1979 expedition, we are left with a haunting silence. The bodies of Ray, Genet, and the brave men who tried to recover Hannelore are now part of the eternal landscape of Everest. They are woven into the tapestry of the mountain, joined by hundreds of others who dared to reach for the heavens and never returned. It is easy to judge from the comfort of our living rooms. It is easy to say they should have turned back earlier. It is easy to say that no view is worth a life. But to understand Ray the pirate Genet, you have to understand that some spirits are simply too big to be contained by safety. Ray didn't go to Everest to die. He went there because he had an insatiable hunger to live. He wanted to stand where the air was thin and the world was vast. He lived his life at full volume, and perhaps, in a tragic poetic sense, it was inevitable that his final resting place would be the highest point on earth, closer to the stars than to the ground. Hannelore Schmatz proved that endurance and will are not the exclusive domain of men. She fought until her heart could literally fight no more. Her vigil, as the Sentinel, was a grim chapter, but her release into the Kanchang face in 1984 finally gave her the peace she deserved. Their story teaches us a profound lesson about the second summit. Reaching the top is only half the journey. The true summit is the front door of your home. The true victory is the return. The mountain will always be there, indifferent and majestic, but our time upon this earth is fragile and fleeting. It reminds us that in the face of nature's overwhelming power, humility is the only armor that truly protects us. If this story touched you, if you felt the chill of the death zone and the weight of the decisions made in that thin air, then you are in the right place. Here at Ben Stories, we are building a library of the most gripping true-to-life tales from history. We don't just tell you what happened, we want you to feel it. We honor the fallen by remembering their names and their struggles. But we can't do it without you. We need you to help us keep these stories alive. So, I am asking you now, please click that red subscribe button, join our community, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the unknown. And I want to hear from you in the comments below. It's a question I ask myself often. If you were in Ray's boots, 500 feet from the summit but running out of time, would you have turned back? Or is the pull of the top too strong to resist? Let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching, thank you for respecting the history, and until next time, stay curious, and stay safe. This is Ben Stories, signing off.